Scripture reading this evening come from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on a rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall.
You know, as we look tonight at the parable of the wise man and the foolish man, I want us to think about what a parable is, first of all. It comes from two words, para and bole. Para, where we get our word like parallel, alongside, bole, to throw. And so literally the word parable means to throw alongside, to have something here and to throw this over here alongside of it as an illustration. And Jesus uses the word to compare. In verse 24 of our text, he says, Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. You hear that term, compared to? See, he's throwing it alongside this idea of those that hear his words and act upon them. Well, this parable comes at the end of 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. This is really the conclusion of Jesus' sermon. And as he looks at these people that he's been teaching now, he understands that they have heard, and now they are going to need to act upon the things that they have been taught on that particular day. The illustration of that need and the results, the illustration of that is seen in this parable, and the results that are going to come through whichever choice you may make are also shown within this parable that Jesus gives here at the end of that magnificent Sermon on the Mount. Well, what we have is we have two men, and there are two men that have some similarities. They have some things that are very much the same, and then we have a distinct difference. Guys, I believe that maybe this mic is on too. I'm getting a little bit of extra when I'm right here. Okay, I got the thumbs up. That must have fixed it. First thing that we see in the similarities of these men is that they both heard the words of Jesus, both men. And we haven't even designated wise and foolish yet. These are just the things that both of these men had in common with each other. They both heard the words of Jesus. You know, many people hear the words of Jesus. Many people heard them there in the time of his ministry. In this particular sermon itself, he's teaching this sermon to a multitude of people across a large plain. And so, you know, there is a lot of people here. While we don't have a count, there's a lot of people that are having the opportunity to hear the words of Jesus. And many people today as well hear the words of Jesus that are found within the Bible also. So there is an application for us today, and there was certainly an application for the people that he was teaching that particular day there on the Mount. Well, what we need to understand is that upon hearing God's Word, there is an accountability that each of us must understand that we have now. We see this in Matthew chapter 12, verses 41 through 42, where Jesus said, The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up with this generation at the judgment and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. So what Jesus is saying here is that you hearing me teach, you hearing the things that I am saying to you, is going to be something that you're going to give an account for one day. And in fact, There are going to be people that will stand up in the judgment day and condemn you because of the opportunity that you had and that you rejected. You're the people of Nineveh that repented at the preaching of a preacher that hated them. A preacher that said nothing more than God required him to say. City's going to be destroyed in 40 days if you don't repent. I mean, he made no extra effort because he wanted every single one of them to die. And so even after he walked through the city and just said it and walked straight through, and he went out and sat down on the hill overlooking the city and waited for it to happen. And they responded to that preacher. And who did they have? He said, behold, take a good look. You have somebody far better than Jonah. A preacher, a teacher that loves you. A teacher that cares. A teacher that will go to great lengths to help you come and be what you're supposed to be before God. That's what they had. And that's why the men of Nineveh one day will stand up in the judgment and condemn them. The Queen of Sheba, she came from far away to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But with all the wisdom that Solomon had, Solomon was a total wreck in life. Jesus never was that. I've seen questions even at Bible bowls that said, who's the wisest man? And the correct answer was Solomon. No, folks, he's not. According to Jesus, Jesus is the wisest man. Someone wiser. And so she's going to stand up and she's going to condemn them because she went to Solomon, who was terribly flawed, and they have the perfect Son of God. And they're rejecting him. Open your Bibles with me over to Matthew chapter 11. We were there this morning. We're going to look at a different set of texts there, 21 through 24. Jesus is talking about the cities that he did most of his work in, most of his miracles in, where most of his ministry took place over the 3 years of his ministry. He says, woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. I don't pretend to understand. We're going to continue here in this text. Don't go away from there. I don't pretend to understand how the degrees in regard to hell are going to be. I don't pretend to understand why some will suffer more than others, but that is a biblical fact. Peter even says as much. I don't understand that or how that's going to happen, but it's true. And here he says judgment's going to be more bearable on the sinful cities of Tyre and Sidon than it's going to be on you because you saw and heard me. Listen to what else he says. And you, Capernaum. This is where the majority of his ministry took place. Will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you, it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than it will be for you. That's kind of hard to grasp, isn't it? But it shows the incredible level of accountability. I certainly do not believe that Capernaum was guilty of the sexual immorality and the evil that was in the city of Sodom, but they had the Son of God there more than anywhere else. No group of people got to see and hear Jesus more than probably that one town. And they still didn't believe. And they were going to be held accountable for it one day. And it was going to be something that would affect their judgment. Like both of these men, each of us have heard the words of Jesus. And I wonder someday, I wonder if Jesus was talking today to us like he was talking to Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum. And we have 5, 6, 7 Bibles apiece, right? I remember when the Cold War ended and the Iron Curtain came down, they shipped Bibles to Moscow, and people lined up for miles to just get a Bible. And we have them sitting all over the place. And do we open them? Will people that don't have access to Bibles, people in Africa, people in China, that it's all they can do to get a Bible, will they stand up one day and condemn us because of what we have and we just don't use it? It's very similar to what Jesus is saying. Will churches in Africa stand up and condemn the churches in America for if they had the resources that we have, they would have done more? It's a good question. But there is an accountability to having the Word of God available, to hearing the words of Jesus. And hearing is a good start. In fact, it is where it all begins. All journeys to Jesus Christ begins with hearing His words. That's just the way it's always going to be. It's the way it is designed. And it is a good start. And both of these two men have started in that place. They both started at the same place. You might be talking about two men standing right there on that plain that day, hearing that Sermon on the Mount. Well, the second thing that we see is that they both built a house, didn't they? They both heard. They both built a house. The house is one's life. And really, while some people may never hear the gospel, everybody builds a house, don't they? A house of life. Everybody builds their life in some particular way. Each of us will do that. And the quality and effort put in is unique to each person's decisions. You know, some in the building the house of their life will build, they'll have a simple life. They'll build a little 2-room house, maybe. Some with a very busy life will have 10 bedrooms and 10 bathrooms, right? It'll be all over the place. It'll be a huge house because they're so busy. Some lives that are just simply a wreck show a house that has very little maintenance, very little upkeep, very little taking time to make sure that the house is what it needs to be. Now, the freedom of choice that God gave each person allows the variety of the types of life houses we might build to be infinite and to be unique to every single person that lives upon this earth. We all choose how we're going to build with what God has given to us in this life. You choose today, and I choose today. Everyone chooses each day how they're going to build their life. And the house you build will be determined by your priorities, first and foremost. The house you build will be determined by your emotions. It will be determined by your morality. It will be determined by your decision making throughout life. And what governs your building will really make all the difference in the world. Words of Jesus in this context or some other design by men. The way men say you should live life in contrast to how Jesus says to live life. See, there's going to be a major difference in the houses, right? In how we build. Because the world will tell you that they haven't understood. They understand how a person should live, how a person should be, and yet it so often is in contrast with the perfect Son of God and what He showed as a perfect life when He was upon this earth. So what kind of house are you building today is a question we need to ask ourselves. Third, both men endured a storm, didn't they? There are two possible ideas behind the storms. In fact, I'm not sure that it's an either-or thing. I think Jesus could be making application in both areas here because both would be supported by the rest of Scripture. First of all, these storms could be life difficulties. The way in which the rains and floods beat upon these houses would be indicative of the world and how it beats upon our lives. And it seeks to destroy us most oftentimes. Jesus' words guide people to strength. They guide people to the blessings of God. They enable people to endure. That's why David would say, as he talked about the Lord being his shepherd, that he would go through those valleys of deep darkness because the rod and the staff of the shepherd comforted him. That he found restoration from the shepherd. And so we see that David there understood how to make it through the storms of life, and certainly he suffered some serious storms in his life as a result of poor choices that he made, but God was always there. You know, when we listen to the words of Jesus and we put them into our lives and we live them and we live by faith, folks, there's nothing this world can throw at us that's going to hurt us. Oh, they may kill us. Now, I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying hurt us in the eternal sense. I always think back to Nadab. Well, I've got the names wrong. Wow. Now that I messed it up. But let's just not even talk about that. I think back about Job. I'll get to it in a minute. I think about Job and what he went through. And I can't, as I read the book of Job, I can't imagine going through what he went through. And I'll even stop just on the first day, right? I can't imagine losing everything and every my family, my children. I can't imagine losing all of that in moments. Not spread out over time, but literally messengers are coming in one right after the other. And then to turn right around very shortly after that and have my health completely destroyed, to where there are festering sores from the bottom of my feet to the top of my head. All he could do is just sit there and scrape his festering body. And yet it was his faith in God that saw him through and showed him to be the man that he was. Well, think about the Apostle Paul and the persecution that he suffered and the times that he was beaten that we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and all the things that he went through. And yet he would write in Romans 8:37, but in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer. How, Paul? How do you overwhelmingly conquer when you go through all the things that you have gone through? He says, through Him who loved us. Through Jesus Christ. Life can be tough, folks. And faith's the answer. God's the answer. Jesus Christ is the answer to getting through a difficult life. And we think about the three young men that was being put into the fiery furnace on that particular day in the book of Daniel. And they said, yes, our God can save us. But even if He doesn't, we'll still be His servants. We will not bow to your image. Jesus is the answer to the woes and the difficulties of this world. So that's one possible explanation for the storm that came up on these houses. Certainly, it may be more contextually supported in this particular text, is the idea that it's judgment. And, both houses were built, and both houses were then subjected to the trial of judgment. And judgment is going to reveal all structural defects, right? I guess if we want to keep using the house idea, it's going to reveal all structural defects. Just as when I stand before the judgment seat of Christ, there's no amount of facades that I can have that will ever fool God. And everything that is lacking in my life, everything that I refuse to do in my life that God wanted me to do, everything that shouldn't be in my life as a disciple of Jesus Christ, it will be seen. Solomon made it clear that the judgment day would bring everything before God, those things that are secret and those things that are open. And he had said that's why you fear God and keep His commandments in this life. Because you're going to face Him one day and you can't be hidden. So when these storms come against these houses, the structural weaknesses are going to be made clear. When we think about this idea of the storms, folks, I know we talk about death and taxes being the certainties in life, but certainties in life are difficulties. Nobody lives this life without going through difficult times. Certainty in this life is judgment. So those two things are most certain to happen. So any house built, it needs to be built to deal with the difficulties of this life, and it needs to be built to deal with the surety of judgment one day, so that we do not fall, but instead that we stand firm when the rains and the floods and the winds, whether it be of judgment or difficulties, beat upon the houses of our lives. So we have three similarities. These men did these three things. Both of them did. But then we have one difference, don't we? That's usually all it takes. There's one difference between these two men, and it made all the difference in the end. Each heard, but the fine line between being wise and being foolish is what happens after one hears. I don't care how nice a house you build. I don't care how big a house you build. If that house doesn't have a good foundation, that house ain't going to last long. That's just kind of a common rule for houses. Foundation is everything. And the house has to have a strong foundation in order to stand strong over the years. And so that's really what we're talking about here is the foundation. What can one do then with the words that they hear? If there is a major difference and it comes as a result of what they've heard, we see that the wise man acts upon those words. He acts upon the words that Jesus says, and as a result, he builds on a rock. Something that is solid, something that is immovable. And that is the case with the truth of Jesus Christ. The truth of Jesus Christ is immovable. It never changes. Truth changes every day out in the world as they perceive truth. And I'm using that word loosely for them. The truth of today is far different than the truth in people's minds in the world 20 years ago, don't you think? And what male or female is, what marriage is. Truth has changed drastically in the last few decades in regard to what was considered 20 years ago fundamental and true for all people and absolute. And now it's changed because the world's truth doesn't stay the same. Jesus' truth is eternal. In the same sermons preached in the 20s of last century, the same sermons my dad preached when he started preaching back in the 60s, and the sermons I'm preaching today are still the same sermons and the same truth. And I could pick up a book from the 1940s of sermons for you, and I could stand up here and I could read it, and it would be as applicable now as it was in 1940. Because God's truth doesn't change. I can read you Peter's sermon, if you want to go back even further, right? And it's as applicable today as it was when he spoke it in AD 33. So the truth of Jesus is firm and immovable. The foolish man, however, he does not act upon the words of Jesus, so he builds on what the world says, and the world keeps changing. As we just mentioned, the truths just keep changing. And so it is an ever-shifting sand. I like to go to the beach. I like to get out there like a kid. I know people go, look at that big fat kid out there building sandcastles. But I like to build sandcastles. I think that's kind of cool. I like to build it, I'll be honest with you, I like to build it just a little bit close to the wave line, knowing that the tide's going to come in, right? Because I want to watch it. And so you build it, and then the minute those waves hit it, folks, it's gone. It doesn't hold up even to the first wave. I mean, the first wave comes through and it's wiped out. Because sand just has no ability to hold itself against that kind of force. There's no solid truth of the world that can be relied upon. It changes all the time. And if we try to hold to those things of the world, it'll pull our house in all kinds of directions. When I lived in Denver, I remember looking when we were shopping for houses. There are places in Denver where the soil moves. I mean, it moves a lot. And you'll come across houses that have been built, and part of the house might be built and might be catching some of that moving aspect of that soil. And what happens is it'll literally rip the house in half. That's how powerful it is. And so if you'll go down in the basement of a house, and you'll see these bolts that are about this big. And there'll be about 8 or 9 of them in the concrete wall of the basement. And what they've done is they've drilled all the way down to bedrock and screwed big, huge metal pipes into that bedrock and brought them up and bolted them to that house to hold that house steady so it doesn't get pulled in two. So they're literally having to get to the rock. Why? Because the ground they're built on is shifting. So we need to build on a rock. Or it's foolish to build on ground that you know isn't going to hold underneath your house. A house built on a foundation of Jesus will have some characteristics which are clear. And they are the characteristics seen in the Sermon on the Mount. You cannot talk about this parable and not talk about the Sermon on the Mount. It is the summation of it. It is the conclusion of that sermon. So when we think about the house that we need to build, the 3 chapters previous to this parable are giving us the characteristics of what it means to build on the rock. I'm just going to give you these in real brief summary. I'm not going to expound on any of them, but just to kind of walk us through the Sermon on the Mount and what we're told to be. Because the entire Sermon on the Mount is Jesus telling you and me, this is what my disciples look like. He's painting a picture. They are people of humility. They are people who are remorseful for their sins. They are meek. They desire righteousness. They show mercy. They seek peace. Peace with God and peace with other men. They live a purity of life. They are willing to suffer for Christ. They live in a way as to impact all others around them, to shine the light, to be a preserving force of salt to those that are in the world around them. They live with a heart that is given to the right, so that their actions are right from that heart. And so they are right through and through. It's not just outward actions, but it is an inward heart that guides those righteous actions. They have motivations that are for God and God only, and not for the praise of men. They seek God first and His kingdom, trusting that God will provide the blessings that He has so readily promised that He will. They judge by a single standard, and it is a standard that they themselves live by. There's not one standard for me and another standard for, as they say today, ye. There is one standard, and we live by it, and we do judge others by it. We do to others as we would want done unto us. We treat others the way we want to be treated. And their devotion to God is more than words. It is obedience. That's why Jesus said just before this parable, there will be those in that final day, that judgment day, that storm day, that'll say, Lord, Lord, did we not do all these things in your name? And He's going to say, I never knew you. I never knew you because you did not do the will of my Father in heaven. So devotion is seen in obedience to the will of the Father. Folks, that's the Sermon on the Mount in about a minute, about 60 seconds. But it's a lifetime study for us to continuously dive into the depths of what Jesus was saying that day on that plain, so that we can be more and more the people that He desires for us to be. You know, when we look at this parable here at the end of the sermon, it's Jesus' invitation. You know, preachers, we always try to sum it up. We try to bring it in home in the invitation. We want to do that. We want to encourage people. We want to find a way to go that direction, to encourage people to do what Jesus says. And you know, every invitation is about a choice, isn't it? I may talk about in the invitation those that haven't obeyed the gospel, and I encourage them to make the right choice in that. I encourage Christians that aren't living as they should to make the right choice. It's always about a choice. And really, Jesus' invitation here in this parable is about a choice, isn't it? 2 men heard the words of Jesus, and each man made a choice. One was foolish. One was wise. But that choice was everything. What kind of life house are you choosing today to build? What do you do with the words of Jesus Christ? Will someone stand up one day in judgment and condemn you because if they had the opportunities you had, they would have done so much more? than what you've done with them. Folks, the storm will come. There's no way to avoid it. There's no way to escape it. The storm will come, and foundation will be everything. Foundation will make all the difference. It will be the fine line of what is done with the words of Jesus that means everything on that particular day. It is the difference between being wise. It is the difference between being wise and foolish. It is the difference between standing firm and having the phrase about your life be, and great was the fall thereof. May God help us that no one here ever knows the meaning of those words in their life. But that we stand firm even in the face of the storms of life and the storm of judgment. Be wise with what Jesus has given you. And it will make you in life unbeatable. I'm not saying you're not going to lose at times, because you will, but you'll never be defeated. When I look at Joseph, I think he's a great example. You know, he could be defeated over and over, and he really was oftentimes, and yet they never could defeat Joseph. He just kept coming back. Why? Because he held true to God, to what was right. So the words of Jesus prepare you. They make you strong. They make your life built on a rock that will not move. And whatever comes, you'll endure it. And that includes the judgment day one day. This evening, if you haven't been building on the words of Jesus Christ, if you haven't been building on the rock, know that your foundation's not very good. But you can change that. Change that tonight. If we can assist you in that, we want to do so as we stand, as we sing.